Okay, and I just turned on the recording. Um, so just to remind everyone before we formally get started, we record these sessions. I usually will send out a transcript of whatever we talked about, or at least an analysis of anything valuable that people want to know. If there was a slideshow, we'd send a copy of that to everyone as well. And so everyone is registered will get, including you, Alfie. Um, And by the way, for those of you that only want to be here for Alfie, like Alfie, if you don't want to continue to get notices about our weekly series, just unsubscribe and you won't be constantly getting emails from it. But you don't have to unsubscribe from Montessori Foundation emails unless you really want to. Okay, Alfie, I appreciate that you probably are short on time, and I will formally get us started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Selden, and this is Independent School Leaders Forum. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Lindsay Pollack, who is the provost of Sarasota University. I see that we also have our friend, Dr. Bill Summers, and we have my old friend, Alfie Kohn, who is known, I hope, to all of you, somebody who, for many of us, was one of the early voices in educational rationalism, or shall we say, let's take a fresh look at what really works and where the nonsense is. So today we could talk about so many things, Alfie, from the tyranny of grading and so forth. But today, my goal is to talk with you a little bit about John Dewey, who was my original inspiration. My mom was up at Columbia. The Barry School started as a progressive school. Where are all of the progressive schools today? I mean, when I started after Mom's death in 1971 in Washington, D.C., there was the Barry School, there was the Field School, there was the Edmund Burke School, there was the Everhart School, there was Georgetown Day School. I mean, we had a lot of progressive schools. Sandy Springs Friends School. Today, almost every one of them is a prep school. Some other are flat out, $50,000 a year, highly competitive. They talk just like any other prep school. And we see that in New York City, and we see that in Boston. We see it everywhere. Alfie, what the heck happened?
Well, first we have to break down what we mean by a progressive school. What allows that that nomenclature? What rules it out? Does the fact that it's a private school and charges a lot of money mean that it's not progressive? Does the fact that it describes itself as preparatory mean that it can't be progressive? What if the lower school is very different from the upper school? What if it's progressive with respect to how language arts is taught, but not so much math, or with respect to building community and promoting social and emotional development, but doesn't do quite as well with some of the academics? What about if it's progressive in terms of promoting collaboration, but they still use worksheets and so on? So, I mean, I've written on this. You may have too. A number of books and articles have tried to wrestle with the question of what does it mean to be progressive. Um, are there fewer progressive schools by a reasonable definition today than 20 years ago, than 50 years ago? We have to decide also what's the earlier point to which we're comparing ourselves. I don't know the answer to that. I have some thoughts about what progressive means. I have some thoughts on why it makes sense. I'm not the best person to talk to in terms of a census of how many schools and teachers are best described that way. It's on a continuum, or actually on many continua, given that there's different standards for it. Um, most progressive schools are private, but that doesn't mean that most private schools are progressive. And when people ask me for advice, I say you're much more likely to find a remarkable progressive classroom than an entire progressive school. So that's my overview about what complicates our ability to give a quick answer to the question, are there fewer, and if so, how come?
Alfie, when we look back to the early years of the 1900s, I think my mom was up at Columbia, if I remember correctly, in the 20s. Um, I know what she thought progressive was, but when you think of it from your own vantage point, long after John Dewey passed away, and from the scene, what's your sense of what he had in mind that's important?
Um, the idea that democracy, where people who are involved in any enterprise have a significant role to play in determining the nature of that enterprise, democracy in everyday life. Um, I'm not sure the extent to which Dewey himself followed through with that in the schools. The people who followed him, people like William Kilpatrick, who came up with the idea of project-based learning, did more with the idea of Deweyan progressivism than he did himself. And some of his early forays into actual education and application of these ideas didn't always give a big role to the kids, for that matter. But he was also concerned with the extent to which actual practical implications of how an idea plays out in people's real lives and experiences makes helps us to define what education can be. It's more bottom up than it is top down. And he saw schooling as part of a larger community. He came to this not primarily as someone steeped in pedagogy, but a philosopher who was interested in what a whole society could be and what it means for that society to be based on the real needs and experiences of the people living in it. And thus the question became, how can schooling contribute to that?
I think that,
I think that,
we're starting to get an echo, I
starting to get
think.
an echo, I think.
Yes, that just
Yes, that
happened.
just
Maybe
happened.
somebody
Maybe somebody
didn't mute or
didn't mute
unmuted.
or unmuted.
Carrie, I see you're
Gary, I see
unmuted just in case it's yours. Again, please feel free to unmute anytime, anyone. And do feel free to put things into the chat if you want, or just unmute and talk to us because again, it's meant to be a conversation. So when I think about the first Dewey book that I remember, the Schools of Tomorrow, which I think someone needs to do a new one 100 years later, don't you think? Same title and look at the same thing from a new lens. But when I think of it, I think of child honoring. And when I think of Montessori, one of my struggles is the teacher who wants to go in the classroom a half an hour before the kids arrive or stay a half hour later to prepare the environment or restore the environment. And I keep thinking, well, wait a minute. Where are all the children on the Montessori school boards? Where are all the kids on the strategic planning committees? To what extent is it truly a children's house? And to me, when I think of Dewey, what he's talking about is what you've mentioned, Alfie, the idea that even though it may not be a democracy in a school, we certainly want kids to feel like they've got a voice, that if they think that something could be better, that at least they're heard, and that they feel that they're honored. Child honoring is one of my favorite terms for where we are in common with democratic schools and Sudbury schools and Waldorf schools and all these different schools. Child honoring.
And to some extent, the question then becomes for Deweyans and Montessorians, is that environment prepared for the kids or with the kids? And the same is true of the curriculum itself. And the more we plunge into what great progressive education looks like at its best, the more we begin to get, I think, implicitly an answer to an answer to your first question, which is, why are there so few truly progressive schools? And that's because this stuff is challenging on many different levels for many different constituencies. It's first of all, it's more challenging for the kids to have some responsibility for defining the educational environment and being co-creators of the curriculum, and for thinking deeply about ideas from the inside out than it is to simply do what the teacher says um, and memorize a bunch of facts and spit them out on a quiz. It's even more challenging for teachers on several different levels. If you're going to have kids participate in constructing knowledge rather than just having information transmitted to them, you as the teacher need several characteristics which are not so easy to come by. The first is a truly deep understanding of the content you're teaching. You can coast on a superficial understanding if you're just lecturing, you know. But you really have to understand mathematical concepts, even at an elementary school level, if you're going to have the kids construct the idea of place value, than if you simply teach them algorithms or techniques. Second, you need to have some real understanding of pedagogy itself. You know, the traditional assumption says if you know enough about science, you can come in and be a science teacher. But of course, people who know a lot about science or about literature may know nothing about what it means to help people learn science and literature. And so you have to be really good at teaching, and you have to be prepared for uncertainty. You know, a great progressive lesson is more like a jazz improvisation than it is, you know, a recital. And you have to be willing and able to give up control about significant things that most teachers retain control of. And that starts to speak to the personality, not just the a set of proficiencies. Those are asking a lot. That sets the bar high. It's very hard to be a progressive teacher because progressive education asks more of all the learners in the room, including the one facilitating the learner. And then, of course, it's challenging for a whole society. Do we really want the kind of critical thinkers that progressive education tends to yield? That's extremely inconvenient for the people in power. It challenges our culture's addiction to competition, to standardized testing as a metric. It challenges all sorts of things. And a lot of parents are impressed by the wrong things in classrooms and exert pressure to make teaching a little bit worse, which is a whole conversation in its own right. So the amazing thing is that there's any great progressive classrooms. Maybe that's the more logical question to ask, is how do any of them survive against the way the current flows? And that's why, to stay on that metaphor for a second, there's such a powerful undertow pulling progressive schools back to the mainstream.
That's well said. Karen, you've had your hand up, please.
Hi, Alfie Kohn. Thank you so much for being here. It's so exciting thanks Tim for having him on. Um, I saw you first when I went to a Learning in the Brain conference at MIT a number of years ago. You were the keynote speaker, I believe.
Mhm.
And it was wonderful. Nice to hear. I'm a Montessori trained teacher, although I started in public schools and then I went into private schools in the Boston area for, 5 years as a
Mhm.
humanities teacher. And then I learned about Montessori when my kids went into a Montessori classroom. And then since then, I was there for 17 years in a Montessori school. And when I left, I couldn't believe what I saw when I had students coming into the seventh and eighth grade from this progressive approach to education. And because of that, I am now in the doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, the first Montessori doctoral program in the country. And it's everything you're saying here is just so on target with what I've experienced. Also, my kids went to a Ted Sizer Essential School in here in Ayer and Devens, and my sister was helping set up the Rocky Mountain School for Expeditionary Learning in her teaching career after she taught in Denver Public. So, what's exciting is having been a part of the generation where this kind of progressive education has had a say. I mean, there are examples of it, and my kids have been able to live it and um, they do keep going. We still have essential schools. We still have expeditionary learning schools. I know they're under threat today, obviously. But one of my questions in my doctoral program for my research is, what are the elements that come together to create a holistic form of education? And what I've come across is there's this idea of complexity theory. And complexity theory is sort of talking about humans as biological creatures. And it's like all of the properties that are in complex systems, adaptive systems, are what I see in these holistic systems. And the goal for me is, how do we get the academy to understand or to see that there are even scientific reasons, if you're not going to listen to other kinds of reasons, philosophical reasons, that to create environments where children can have an opportunity to emerge, not to pass tests, where children can become who they are, not to become who you want them to be. And so I just wanted to share that with you because I've been working on this for quite a while, and I'm excited about it. I'd love to be able to talk to you about it at some point. But anyway, thank you. This is just exciting, and you gave me more energy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And keep jumping in like this. I really love it. And again, I encourage any of you to turn on your cameras and talk to us, or keep your camera off and open up the mic. Lindsay, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to jump in? You usually do.
Thanks, Tim. I experienced progressive education myself as a student at the Mankato State University Lab School. And when we were talking about co-constructing or student-led curriculum, it took me back to those days as a student where we had the opportunity to create our own learning contracts, our own learning trajectories, with some parameters around requirements for group projects, and a rubric of options to choose from. But having that ability to choose the topics that were calling to us was so empowering as a student, and has carried with me, has I have carried that with me to even as an adult today, and find that the excitement that is generated from being able to interrogate a subject um, was addicting to me as a kid, and really set me on the trajectory, I think, to become a lifelong learner. And I know, Alfie, one of the things that, you so inspired our school at Garden Oaks when you came and were a guest speaker for our school transition as we became a public Montessori. I'm just, I, you know, I'm I'm so interested in maybe what your perspective is on this return to the more traditional way of doing school, if you will, and the parallels to what we see happening in our society. Do you see those two things going hand in hand, or what's your take on the whole phenomenon? And
Well, I rambled a bit already about the
yes,
extent
you did.
to
Yeah.
which, why progressive schooling has always been a minority uh, version of education. Whether it's really worse today than it was a certain number of years ago, I'm not sure. It has always battled for that. It went through periods where there were a lot more people talking about it, especially in universities. It during and right after Dewey's lifetime, in the 1930s, early 40s, there was a lot of talk about it. There was again in the 60s and early 70s. But even during its relative high points, it was never, you know, what most teachers and schools were doing. And now, of course, the very idea of public education, which I think of as a cornerstone of a democratic society, is under assault in a way that has been true to some extent, but never as powerfully as it is right now. So many of us are, linking arms, so to speak, to protect the very idea of public education, before we even get to the question of the ideal kind of curriculum and pedagogy for use there. So yes, just as from Dewey's perspective, progressive education is part of a more democratic society, so it's the case that a society that is becoming less democratic and more authoritarian will necessarily filter down and undermine attempts to do good things in the schools. So it's it's a screen door. It's not a wooden door that serves as a boundary between school and the rest of society, and that's true for good and for ill. So one of the problems, I don't want to lean too heavily on this one though, is whenever you accede to judging the success of anything about education in terms of standardized test scores, you give up the game before it's begun. Because standardized tests measure what matters least, intellectually speaking. And often it's not, high scores are not only meaningless, they're a bad sign because of what had to be sacrificed in order to raise those scores. So every newspaper reporter on education who mindlessly reports test scores as representing higher achievement or more success is undermining the quality of education. And to that extent, one of the battles we have to continuously wage is to challenge the use of those test scores, including as a dependent variable in research on education, as well as the way that results are reported. But higher test scores becomes the default goal in the absence of a community dialogue about our goals. We have to figure out together explicitly what we think a great education consists of. We have to be clear about the objectives for the kids who come out of our schools and bring in other people to tap into their goals. Whenever I do a talk to educators or for parents about parenting for that matter, I almost always begin by asking, what are your long-term goals for your kids? How do you hope they'll turn out? And it turns out there's a remarkable degree of consensus around this, where even people who wouldn't describe themselves as progressives, as either parents or educators, tend to say a lot of the same things. Well, I want my kid or I want my students to be happy, ethical, caring and compassionate, self-motivated, curious, critical thinkers, creative people, stuff like that. And then what I do for a living is I say to people, you say you want this, so why are you doing that? And so progressive education is a lot closer to the ultimate goals for kids that most adults on reflection tend to honor. And our job is to help them see that, or to put it at the same thing in the negative, to realize that traditional education, which is what's on offer by default, is inconsistent with and even vitiates the things that you, not just I, want for our kids in the long run. And that becomes a kind of lever we can use, a kind of strategy for helping people to realize that. Looking forward to what we want for kids and recognizing that something more similar to what you and I might call progressive is likely to bring that about. Another way to do that is to look backward and to ask people who are not necessarily part of our tribe to reflect on what school was like for them. What was it like when you learned to read? What was your elementary school education like? How happy were you in high school? What was going on? And when you were delighted by your schooling, which might have occurred only occasionally, what was happening in those classrooms then? And when you ask people questions like that, they're likely to say, well, it didn't happen often, but when I was thrilled with education and was sorry to hear the bell ring or to have the day end, it was because then I was collaborating with other kids, not sitting in a desk by myself. Or then it was our ideas that we got to pick what to study, or we were doing something actively, not just sitting there listening, or whatever. And then you help people connect the dots retrospectively to say, don't our kids today deserve what made education valuable on those few occasions? Shouldn't we give that to them all the time? Because that's what progressive education is. And so you draw on their own experience to construct a defensive progressive education, even though they never recognized that that aligns with their own experiences of when education was thrilling.
Bill, you've got your hand up.
Yes. First, I just want to honor you, Alfie, for being one of those people out there in front years ago and pushing the edges and trying to talk reality. It's interesting to me that we need courageous people right now. And of course, my focus right now is how do we build leaders who have the courage to get out there in front and make that case? And Lindsay and I are talking about that at Sarasota as well. But we can learn from feedback. What was it? Most parents are operating on a 30 or 40 year time cycle, that what it was. Yeah, you tell me what 2030 and 2040 standards are, I'm all in. But I don't know what they are, but we certainly have to build creativity. I just, going feed forward, how are we going to attract and support those courageous leaders who are going to take this on? When I've come out of retirement to turn around schools, somebody asked me, how do you do that? I said, I put on iron underwear, because you can get your ass kicked from all sides. But you got to know what you believe in. And I'm not against assessment, although standardized tests are intellectually lazy, in my opinion. But why aren't we testing efficacy, learned optimism, grit, all kinds of things that are going to, that's what the most innovative businesses are looking for. And we so far are not being able to get government bureaucrats as well as some business people. They're just not there yet. And
well, I think a lot of the business people who talk about, thinking outside the box tend to do that in a way where the box itself never changes. And to sort of reframe your question, I'm all in favor of people who have a high tolerance for risk. I wrote an article once called Encouraging Courage about what teachers need to do. But I want to spend most of my efforts not on trying to raise individuals who are courageous any more than I want to spend effort teaching kids to develop grit and persistence, because those are deeply conservative ideas insofar as they ratify the status quo and fail to question the structures that require courage. I would rather work to create the systems of progressive education such that we don't need to be brave in order to teach that way. We're supported in teaching that way. To continue to focus on individual characteristics like mindsets and temperaments, even including resilience and courage, is to take time away from the radical change of institutions and structures, which is ultimately what will avoid a situation where, as years go by, there are fewer and fewer progressive schools.
You know, One of the things you started off with, Alfie, was the idea that we ought to look at what a progressive school is. And you danced around a little bit, but what's your take on why John Dewey used that term? What did he mean by the word progressive within his time and culture?
Well, the progressive era was not all that progressive in the way we would think of today, even politically speaking, let alone educationally speaking. It was a time when people who thought of themselves as progressive were beginning to build a kind of imperialist foreign policy and supporting eugenics and other things. So it's a word where the Deweyan era connotations I would just as soon see fade, except as an historical study. It's come to mean something else now, drawing from Dewey and from Piaget and from Montessori and from others, that talks about the whole child, that talks about supporting autonomy, about collaboration, about deep understanding, and so on. I don't have much invested in the term, though. And if you want to say, well, this is not progressive, yeah, I want to call it, I mean, I don't like alternative either, which suggests that we're forever going to be the plan B, not the plan A. But I think there are other terms. There are some schools that are allergic to the term progressive because they think it will antagonize parents who get nervous about that. And they try to do progressive education under the radar. But conversely, there are schools that like terms like that, like progressive, but they're not really doing progressive education as I would define it. Or, and it took me a while to figure this out, they are progressive by contemporary meaning of the term in a cultural or political sense, but not so much educationally. They teach about American imperialism and talk about tolerance and saving the planet, and they still give worksheets and quizzes, you know? And so we shouldn't get hung up one way or the other. There's too many false positives and false negatives when there's a disconnect between the lexicon we're using and the substance. Let's agree on what the substance is and why it's meaningful. That may or may not connect with some of the things Dewey was saying. I quote Dewey all the time in my new podcast. I find myself thinking of him constantly, but there are aspects of his work, apart from the fact that he's not really easy to read, is the fact that some of his ideas and his way of turning what he did in the Chicago Lab School wasn't so great in some respects too. So I don't like to have heroes, you know. The same thing is true with Montessori. As you know, some of the AMI people think if Montessori said it, we have to be doing it 100 years later. And if Montessori didn't say it, we can't do it. You know, as Bertolt Brecht once said, happy is the land that doesn't need heroes. Let us borrow selectively and thoughtfully those features of earlier thinkers that still make sense to us and leave behind what doesn't.
Yeah, the myth of the founding mother is one of my favorite bugaboos. The real person was very different from the way many people like to think of her. One of the things that I really appreciate bringing Montessori into this is when I started, and the school that I ended up teaching in and running for 22 years, I actually ran it. The Barry School was very, very progressive. My high school education there as a student was about as neat as you can get. I mean, we did great things. Library of Congress was our library. We had seats of the galleries at the Supreme Court and the congressional hearings. And so it was great. I mean, we learned about the sewer system of Washington, history, the geography, and our teachers were pretty darn Socratic. They asked us questions. What they always said was, we don't give answers. We ask questions here. And it was pretty neat. it was also exhausting. And it was very hard to get teachers that could do this. And they were absolutely outstanding human beings. When we became Montessori, things began to get much easier as an administrator because I had teachers who had a coherent philosophy. They didn't tend to burn out. They tended to have my admiration of Maria Montessori is she was a system thinker. And in the years when my mom was still with me and we were talking about these things, what she always said was John Dewey's mistake was he was not thinking in terms of systems and replicable support systems for teachers, but rather, a series of ideas, an emergent curriculum, which is exhausting to create. So again, I think, probably the best word these days for what we would call progressive schools these days would either be child honoring, which sounds a little flatulent perhaps, or Jerry Mintz's idea of democratic. In fact, those of you who don't know who Jerry Mintz is and Ron Miller and some of that crowd that I know, Alfie, you've had lots of connection with over the years. What an Arrow Association or what is it?
Alternative Education Resource Organization.
Yeah, it's a great group. Little bit on the hippie side in the best of all possible ways, but very democratic and very interesting. If you ever go to an Arrow conference, don't be surprised to see kids running the whole thing. Children speakers. I mean, really very cool. Montessori, that's to me the way a Montessori convention ought to be run, all done by the children.
I went and spoke at Arrow a couple of times, and I always see my job is to make people a little uncomfortable rather than just telling them what they want to hear and making them go, And so for them, I challenged the idea of radical democratic schooling and contrasted it with progressive education by talking about the critical role that the teachers play. Some of the people who talk about unschooling at home or democratic schools tend to see adults as necessarily authoritarian, that when the adult gets involved, that's probably a bad thing unless the kid specifically requested it, and that adults cannot, which is to say, should not be initiating anything. And that's not my view. It's not Dewey's view. It's not Montessori's view. I don't think it's most Montessorians' view. And so, Jerry Mintz helped to bring together people who were Montessorians, radical Democrats in schooling, Waldorfians, other progressives, and so on. All of us huddled together for warmth, since together, we're like a rounding error in thinking about American education. But it's also interesting not to shy away from our philosophical and practical differences. And one of those is the extent to which I believe adults have a critical role to play in a classroom, which sometimes does amount to initiating and suggesting and proposing things that kids might not have thought of themselves, so that we reject the false dichotomy that says either adults are controlling or we have a laissez-faire model where it's mostly hands-off, and then begin to think about what does it mean for adults to work with kids instead of doing things to them, or on the other hand, hanging back.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I think that's the best soundbite for this session that we're doing. I really appreciate that, Jerry. There was a time when my son Mark, who is now 55, he was a student at Goddard College, and for some reason, the students in those days, and the administration of those days, and the faculty in those days seemed to hear about me, and they thought I was a hero. So every time I'd go up to visit him, they would all want to powwow and so forth. What I most remember is the rotting VWs and the trash outside, and in this beautiful Vermont setting, and saying to them, guys, you need some structured order in your life. It's sitting in bed, smoking dope all day. We could do better than this.
Structure is not the same thing as control, even though a lot of people who control try to rationalize it by invoking the word structure, and that's not really what they mean. At this point, I might have to sign off and allow you good folks to continue talking. And I look forward to the day when the average age of a group like this is half of what it is right now, because that will suggest that we have another generation willing to continue this fight and continue to figure out how to make progressive education even better, as well as anchoring it.
Thank you, Alfie. So appreciate you coming.
My pleasure.
So, for those of you that don't know, Alfie is extraordinarily busy and has to actually earn a living, and really appreciate his willingness to give of his time freely to join us and be part of this conversation. One of the things that Lindsay and I want to do is increasingly reach out to the people that we know or the people we don't yet know, who we think, usually you would only see them at a Montessori or some big conference as the keynote speaker, and let you see what they're like in more intimate settings and have these kinds of conversations where you can either sit there like Margaret and be quiet and just watch, or jump in like Karen and say, can we talk? Can we talk separately? I think that's great. So please, if there's somebody that whether you think of it today or whether you think of it next year, because hopefully even after we're gone, our children and our friends will carry on this kind of conversation. Let us know if there's someone you think we should reach out to, whether it's Sylvia Dubovoy or Jane Bluestein or Karen Meese is a little harder to get to come on for free, but you never know. You tell us who you want, and we'll try to get them involved. All
And I
right,
want to
Andy
also,
Hargraves.
I was just going to also acknowledge our friend Bill Summers, who has generously extended his connections, and we've been able to include Art Costa and John Saphir. Yep. Oh, wonderful. Andy Hargraves. Yes. Thank you, Bill. Those are great suggestions. And thank you for also reaching out to your network. And that really applies to everyone here. As you were saying, Tim, the more connections we have and folks that maybe we haven't heard from yet can be guest speakers. We don't provide an honorarium. And so all the folks you see are donating their time to continue our conversations. And so what a great contribution. And we're so grateful for their time and sharing their time and talents with us.
We don't necessarily have to end on this. What we're doing is talking about progressive education at really any age level, but I suspect that most people who really know what progressive education is about look at it either from a Montessori lens, and they struggle with some of the things that I brought up, like, what is the voice of the children in a real Montessori school, and to what extent are Montessori educators really not giving kids much of a voice? What my friend Selma Perry would have called phony baloney, uh, democracy. The kids are allowed to talk when we tell them they can talk. Uh, and when we go to an AMI conference, when we go to an AMS conference, if there are children there, it is normally because they're part of a marching band or they're performing Maria Montessori the musical, which is great. I love seeing it. But that's not the same as them being our partners in education. And I do think it is possible to do that.
Absolutely. And Tim, I have to say, I founded a private school here in the Houston area many years ago based on constructivist theory and the work of John Dewey. I mentioned earlier that my own education included some years at a lab school in Minnesota, and that experience stayed with me, for the rest of my life. And so when my own children were young, I was fortunate enough to meet someone who had the financial backing and appetite to uh, dream together with me. And we founded this school in the Houston area. And we really had this idea that we were doing something revolutionary and exciting and new, co-constructing curriculum and with our children and creating these democratic classrooms. And then years later, after I'd been in public school settings, was when I was introduced formally to the work of Dr. Montessori. So, I'd be interested, to hear from our audience too, where they're practicing. And perhaps we could hear even in the future some stories of how your school came to be and your school story and your journey as a school leader. I know there's a lot of talent in the room right here today.
Mhm. There sure is. Karen, I see you unmuted. Oh, you didn't mean it. You're welcome to talk. It's okay. It's all good. And Carrie,
Well,
I'm getting a walkout just watching you move around your house. I love it.
Sorry
Well, Tim,
about
I'm gonna take a minute to just share with everyone Sarasota University. We are gearing up to launch our third doctoral cohort June 30th, which is coming up soon. So if you're interested in bachelor's, master's, or doctoral studies in Montessori education or Montessori leadership, please feel free to reach out to me. We do have partnerships with a number of teacher education programs. So our adult learners can work on a Montessori credential and work toward their academic aspirations, a degree program at the same time. So I'm going to drop my email in the chat if you're interested in talking about any of those degree options. And sorry, Carrie, if I interrupted you, but we're so happy to see you. And I agree with Tim. I'm getting a workout watching you. So thank you for that.
I want to thank you for offering this availability of these conversations. I appreciate it. Sorry that I am multitasking a little bit as I'm trying to listen, and I look forward to listening again to the recording. But I'm from here in Ohio, so I've been a Montessorian about 28 years, and I've taught preschool through high school and started a farm school and did that for about 10 years. So currently I'm at a school we started about 6 years ago. We're just getting into the elementary grade levels, but I'm very fascinated and I'm intrigued, and I want to ponder the question of, how to involve the children more in the classroom and what that can look like. And it's just a continually, and their voice. Some of my favorite times have definitely been when the children are solving and contributing and sharing their ideas, and that's a real thrill. So just thank you for the conversation.
Carrie, I think what you just brought up is very appropriate within the framework of this webinar. A few quick thoughts for me, and then others, please jump in. Number one, when you're planning for the beginning of the new school year, see if it's still possible to invite your children, even as young as 3, 4, and 5, to come and set up the classrooms with the teachers. Now, it's okay that parents come along, but there's such an experience when the children are hand checking every single material, using the Murphy's oil soap or the lemon and water to clean it, setting it on the shelves, making sure it's perfect. If we were in Japan, children would come to school about 2 weeks before the classes officially start to prepare the school for the new school year, get it perfectly clean. And that's one way to do it. Another is, again, working with your teachers to say, don't worry, a teacher just came in the class into the room that I'm in. To basically say to your teachers, don't go into the room when the children aren't there and do something to change it. It's their room, it's their house, which doesn't mean it's just their house, but the idea of their being involved with restoring the environment, preparing the environment. When I was a kid at Barry, I would show up at 7:15 in the morning, and we would go to the classroom. There was breakfast food there. We had bins of cereals and things like that, and a little refrigerator and milk, and we'd cut up oranges and squeeze orange juice and all kinds of things. And then after we'd had breakfast, if we were hungry, we'd go out to the greenhouse. It was like 5, 6 years old, and we would cut flowers and bring them in and set them up in the little bud vases and all this kind of stuff all through the day. We took turns working in the kitchen with the professional cooks. We had about 600 kids. So every day there were kids who volunteered to work in the kitchen. I guess we didn't always volunteer. I think we were assigned. But we learned to peel potatoes and all kinds of stuff. We had animals, it's a farm school. In fact, my mother would have said to you, Carrie, the correct age for Erdkinder is not 12 to 15. It's 9 to 12 when the typical child is in love with animals. But even as a little kid, like my daughter, Caitlin, who's now, how old is Caitlin? I guess she's 36. When Caitlin was 4 or 5, she got her first horse at Barry and would go out, and it was a school horse. She would go out every day at 2 o'clock rather than whatever they did at the end of the day. She would go for the next, well, we'd drag her home at 6 o'clock. She'd go out and curry horses and help in the riding program. And it's never stopped. And that's the way I was. I got my first horse at age 4. And some of you may know I live with 22 dogs and 4 horses and 2 cats who rule the roost. So there's no one way to do this, but there are a lot of ways to create traditions and systems that give kids more of a voice. One other thought before I shut up. All of us who are involved in secondary education and have some connection to Montessori, one of the things that we probably ought to be thinking about is what is a prepared environment for the adolescent years? And I really ask you to think about that. When you think about the prepared environment for 3 to 6, for the infant toddler, for 6 to 9, 9 to 12, what's it all about? How do we construct it? And what would that look like when you're dealing with more advanced academic topics? In fact, I think a lot of our 9 to 12 teachers need to do this. But I would suggest to you that we haven't done this. At least I'm not aware of it. And I mean, when I was a student at Barry, we had it, and it was called the Dalton Plan. But I think, that's a whole conversation itself if you don't know what the Dalton Plan is. But I think that we need to create something that has the built-in element of choice, and the idea, as I think Bill would say, of, not only am I going to give you a series of choices, but make me a better offer. Show me something that I didn't think of. The farm school in Ohio, are you talking to Carrie?
Yeah, that's where I did
Sorry.
my training at the farm
Yeah.
school. Yeah. And
Oh,
then
yeah,
also
yeah.
the choice was with Betsy Coe too, down in Texas.
Mhm.
I couldn't drive all the way to Texas, but I could drive to Ohio. That's how I decided which one to go to.
They are both wonderful programs. I mean, Betsy's interesting model is so cool because how many kids can afford to or would choose to go to a residential school these days? And even though there are kids who are day students at the farm school, in general, it's a rare thing. It's hard to replicate. There are some. Whereas Betsy's model of every 6 weeks hauling the kids off to a land lab is interesting. I personally like it when you have a facility like the Barry School did, where you have, 45 acres. And if you could have had residential housing there, where every day they're working with the animals like they did when I was a kid as a teacher there. And then say you're going to live in this house with 12 other kids for the next week and learn how to make your coffee in the morning and stuff like that. Anyway, there's so many things you can do. We still have a few minutes. Anyone want to jump in? Bill, you're unmuted, man. Go.
Okay, well, first of all, in late 60s, and I graduated in 1970 from the Price Lab School, University of Northern Iowa, which was an old lab school. And I fell in love with, I was a physics teacher, so we were doing self-paced instruction for physics, chemistry, and math way back then. So I brought that with me when I jumped into administration. Three quick examples. One alternative school I took over after four principals in 5 years. Um, the second year, we did leadership development with the kids. The kids ran the in-service at the beginning of the second year and told how we're going to operate this year. So when a kid was smoking in the bathroom, I had one of our president was said, "Who is he? I'm going to go kick his butt." I said, "No, I'll handle that." But it was interesting to watch the kids take that responsibility. They made it safe. A second one in the urban center when I took over a school, we had about 220 dropouts. And so I recruited about 6 teachers, 85 ninth graders who were at high risk, put them in a room, and I said, "Today, we're going to design a school that'll keep you in school." And now the back, of course, I say, "You're the principal, you figure it out." I said, "Well, yeah, I am the principal, but you're going to figure it out." The next year, we cut the dropout rate in one half by building a family and building that structure in ninth grade. And it was just flat out amazing. Another school that I worked in, we got again high risk ninth graders coming in and got the big four, social science, math, together and said, "You're going to have a block of 5 hours. You do whatever you want to do." But I said, "What are the unifying themes?" And one was patterns. There's patterns in English, there's patterns in math, patterns in science, pattern in history. It was amazing. And then also, being a good citizen, etc. So this can be done. I didn't say it was easy, but it can be done. And in one of those schools, we also started doing a lot of science and math together, biology and home ec together. We were growing our own vegetables, and then I put in a cafe, which I thought was interesting.
The bottom line is nothing is new under the sun. It's all been done somewheres in the world or is being done right now. The trick is to know what's been done that works and then to try to make a curated plan of what are you going to do. So before all of you joined us, Lindsay and Bill and I were talking about systems. And I think that's really it. What we appreciate as Montessori educators is we inherited systems that were developed before we came along. They're not perfect, but they really are an edge. And we just have to keep refining our systems. Karen.
I just wanted to mention that in our research for education textbook, that how research methods that we can use, they've just recently in the last 8 years introduced and said a new paradigm is present now. And part of that is complexity science. So if you're interested, there are so many parallels to complexity science and Montessori and a lot of the holistic programs and progressive programs that we've seen. And it might be helpful, anybody interested in doing research about it, to know that that exists now because it's just so multidimensional. It allows to go beyond the quant and qual way of doing research.
Karen, maybe you'd like to put together a program. Figure out, whether you can lead the discussion or we need to invite somebody, but sounds like something we want to know about.
I would advocate to look at Margaret Wheatley, Leadership in the New Science, and she runs a Berkana Institute out in Utah.
Well, let's co-create, my friends, because this is a Montessori school, right?
Absolutely.
I love it. I have to put in a plug for the Montessori Foundation. So just so you remember, this is brought to you by the Montessori Foundation, which is an organization we started in 1992. It is the continuation of my family's work at the Barry School. So this is Barry culture, philosophy made manifest in the world. we've made a lot of change. The fact that there are leadership training courses and institutes and degrees in Montessori, all of that really started with us. We really pushed that out. We developed the program at Trinity. We helped develop the program at Loyola. Xavier was actually before our time. So I give Xavier and some of the other St. Mary's, there were others out there. But the idea of something is really Montessori based. I am involved with Sarasota University. I'm a trustee. I'm very proud of it. I did never finish my doctorate. Lindsay keeps saying, you could do it, even at your age. You'll be 80 on Tuesday. Who knows? The bottom line is we are school consultants. We're a team of people that are change agents around the world. If you ever need to do strategic planning, a marketing plan, board retreat, curriculum alignment, you name it, we do more than offer advice. We literally like the knights of old, at least in fantasy, we're the good people that come in and help people turn schools around and help you build your dream into reality. So our tagline is we're here to help. We also have the program that you may know called the Montessori Family Alliance. And if you don't know what that's all about, we are using AI in addition to many, 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 many years of articles about everything from nutrition to sleep science to whatever, written with a funny voice for parents. But now we've got Abigail, my trained AI, helping parents to decorate their homes, figure out what to buy their kids for Hanukkah, how to get them to go to sleep. You won't believe what's inside of the Montessori Family Alliance. If you want to know more, go to montessori.org and it's all there. And you can even go in and sign up for a free trial of the Family Alliance. And I really encourage you, take a look, give us feedback, help us make it all better, because without parents who really want to be there, we don't have schools. And I think all of us have struggled. Bill, I see there's chatter going on in the chat. Anything that needs to be put on record? Nope. Just conversations among people. Well, with that said, Lindsay, what's next week?
Next week, Tim, we're going to be looking at case studies. We're going to be utilizing our breakout.
No, we're not. No, we're not, Lindsay.
Oh, gosh,
Remember?
darn it. No, we're not. We're going to be looking at strategic planning.
We're going to
Thank you.
finish
We're going to
part 2 of
continue our
strategic
earlier
planning.
conversation. Thank you, Tim. We had so many positive comments from the conversation we started last week around strategic planning. And so we co-created our part 2 and have responded to the request from the group. So we'll be going back to strategic planning and continuing that conversation. Whether it's
Sounds
part
great.
2 or part 3, who knows? We might just continue on. But next week for sure, strategic planning, and we hope everyone can make it.
As an aside, for those of you that don't know, on Tuesdays, the foundation sponsors another one of these webinars called Finding the Perfect Match. It's all about building community and making the phone ring and handling admissions and so forth. And we also on this Tuesday did part 1 of how to do a market study and develop a marketing plan. And just like what happened to us with strategic planning, it was just overwhelming response. So we're doing part 2 next week. If you're interested, just go to the Montessori Foundation website, or you probably are getting emails from us all the time saying this is what's happening. So sign up if you're ever interested. It's part of what we do for the world. And I think on that note, 4 minutes over, let's say good night. Good night, Charlie. Good night, Karen. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Bill. And Lindsay,
Good night,
thank you.
Tim.
Thank
See
you,
you
and
next
Bill.
week, everybody.
Good
Thanks for being
night.
here.
Hey, Funky, how are you?
Hi. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, dear.
Hope you can see my Montessori t-shirt.
Oh,
I
it's
see
beautiful.
it.
Yeah,
That's
Very
today
nice.
is thank you. Today is our open house. So every Thursday until further notice, I wear the t-shirt and all our staff come in the t-shirt. We make it fashionable and ready to receive people and do a tour. So it's an
Beautiful.
exciting day. So I was doing like 10 things at the same time So I'm glad I'm going to be able to go through the recording.
That's great. Well,
Yes,
please
and
get
I'm looking
Patricia.
forward to next week for sure.
Thanks, Funky.
Sarasota. I'm looking for I don't remember the name, Sarasota University.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll see you
All
all
right.
next week.
Say hi to Patricia and Terrence
I
for me as
will.
well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.